Welcome to Words to Live By, a podcast series hosted by the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Each week, we will share some of the wit and wisdom of Ronald Reagan. In essence, Words to Live By, made up of radio addresses and speeches he delivered from the 1960s through the 1980s. After the recent uprisings at many of America's collegiate institutions, we thought we'd look back on how Governor Reagan handled the situation 50 years ago, in the late 60s and early 70s. In his 1966 campaign for California governor, Republican Ronald Reagan promised to, quote, clean up the mess at Berkeley. Well, at the time, he was referring to student unrest prevalent not just at Berkeley, but on college campuses throughout the state. Students and faculty alike were engaged in protests and demonstrations, strikes, all related to issues such as the draft, civil rights, discrimination, and women's liberation. In one 1966 campaign speech, Reagan declared that many leftist campus movements had transcended legitimate protest, with the actions of, quote, beatniks, radicals, and filthy speech advocates having become more to do with, quote, rioting and with anarchy than academic freedom. His core message was, quote, anarchy in the name of academic freedom on the campus or on our streets will not be tolerated. He blamed university administrators and faculty who pressed their particular value judgments on students. He blamed them for a leadership gap and a morality and decency gap on campus. And he suggested a code of conduct be imposed on faculty to force them to serve as examples of good behavior and decency. He openly criticized the excuse of academic freedom and freedom of expression in allowing the protests and the demonstrations to go on. Using his bully pulpit in his first inaugural address, now this was delivered in January 1967, he said this when he wove two issues together: rising crime and disrespectful behavior on college campuses. Let's listen to this brief excerpt.
And while on the subject of crime, those with a grievance can seek redress in our courts or in our legislature, but not in our public streets. Lawlessness by the mob as with the individual will not be tolerated. We will act firmly and quickly to put down riot or insurrection wherever and whenever the situation requires. And on this subject of education, hundreds of thousands of young men and women will receive an education in our state colleges and our universities. And we're all proud of our ability to provide this opportunity for our youth. And we believe it is no denial of academic freedom to provide that education within a framework of reasonable rules and regulations, nor is it a violation of individual rights to require obedience to those rules and regulations or to insist that those unwilling to abide by those rules seek that education elsewhere. Now, it doesn't constitute political interference with intellectual freedom for the tax-paying citizens of our state who support this college and university system to ask that in addition to teaching, they build character on accepted moral and ethical standards.
In his autobiography, Ronald Reagan wrote about an encounter he had with a number of college students during the peak of unrest on our campuses. What happened was student leaders from 9 campuses of the University of California asked to see him in Sacramento. He was delighted to see them. He invited them into his office. During those days, of course, if he had visited one of their campuses, he'd have started a riot. So he invited them to Sacramento, and when the delegation arrived at the Capitol, some were barefoot, some were wearing torn T-shirts. When the governor entered the room, they sat silently. Some sprawled out on the floor. No one stood up. Then their spokesman began and said, "Governor, we want to talk to you, but, I think you should realize that it's impossible for you to understand us. It's sad, but it's impossible for the members of your generation to understand your own children. You weren't raised in a time of instant communications or satellites and computers, solving problems in seconds, and that previously took hours or days or even weeks to solve. You didn't live in an age of space travel and journeys to the moon, of jet travel, or high-speed electronics. When he paused to take a breath, Governor Reagan said, "You're absolutely right. We didn't have those things when we were your age. We invented them." By the time Ronald Reagan left Sacramento in January 1975, the war in Vietnam ended and collegiate unrest had dissipated. But his concern about what he had observed taking place in education didn't end. In a radio address entitled School Days, this was written in 1978, 2 years before entering the White House, he expressed his concerns, many of which are being echoed today. Let's listen.
Modern-day students in our public schools may have heard their grandparents sing a nostalgic chorus of school days, but they'll never understand it. I'll be right back. Think back for a minute to the lines of that old song, school days, dear old golden rule days, reading and writing and arithmetic taught to the tune of a hickory stick. To a modern-day student, that must sound as far out as Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Author-educator Solveig Eggers has written an essay on whatever happened to the public school and why. She makes the point that over the past 10 years or so, our schools have been drifting away from the traditional concept of teaching towards some idea about shaping the students' emotional and cultural attitudes, involvement in social engineering, and contemporary fads. I've been critical of the National Education Association before in these broadcasts, and here I go again. The NEA has published a document titled Curriculum for the Whole Student. It declares, quote, "The curriculum must move away from an emphasis on retention of facts to an emphasis on the processes of inquiry, comparison, interpretation, and synthesis," unquote. There's more, but that should be enough to give you the idea. Ms. Eggers points out that a flood of so-called progressive innovations, teaching consumer education, environment, minority affairs, and others heavily larded with cultural relativism, have replaced reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Sound familiar? Reagan was signaling the alarm years ago. We'll be right back after this message with the rest of this address. Stay tuned.
The Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation is the nonprofit organization created by President Reagan himself, and specifically charged by him with continuing his legacy and sharing his principles: individual liberty, economic opportunity, global democracy, and national pride. We must remain vigilant and work together to share these conservative principles with younger generations. Your role is critical to move our mission forward. Thank you for your continued support. Please visit reaganfoundation.org/give. That's reaganfoundation.org/give.
Now, back to the story. Ronald Reagan wrote a number of essays on what was wrong with American education, and some of his arguments would fit into the discussion still taking place in the 21st century. Issues on social promotion, the use of phonics to teach reading, the decline in test scores, and the impact of teachers' unions. A strong theme running throughout all of his writing on education is the desirability of local control and the dangers of interference by the federal government. So let's go back to that radio address from 1978, School Days, to hear the rest.
It is this that explains how in our nation's capital an honor student, straight A's and class valedictorian, was rejected by George Washington University because of unsatisfactory scores in his college board exams. He was pronounced unfit for college-level work. The dean of admissions said sympathetically, "He thinks he's a real scholar. His parents think he's a real scholar. He's been deluded into thinking he's gotten an education." Well, do you remember how often we've been told that classes are too big, schools need more money, and so forth? Well, over the last 14 years, spending has increased from around $400 per student to $1,400. Teachers' salaries have almost tripled, and in just 5 years, public school enrollment dropped by more than 50,000 in that Washington school district alone. Total national spending for primary and secondary education is 4 times what it was in 1960. In roughly the same 14 years, student scores in the scholastic aptitude tests, the college entrance exams called SATs, have dropped every year, ranging from totals of 50 points in verbal skills to 30 in math. The sponsors of the test said, quote, "The schools are demanding less and less from students and getting it," unquote. Yet they're handing out higher and higher grades. Homework has been reduced. Heaven forbid education should interfere with watching TV. Playing hooky, now called absenteeism, is ignored, and textbooks simplified. We'd better start singing school days again, this time to the educators. This is Ronald Reagan. Thanks for listening.
As president, Ronald Reagan continued his campaign for more local control in schools and strong core curriculum with high standards. In 1985, he said this.
A recent Gallup poll found that an overwhelming majority of Americans want their schools to do two things above all else: to teach students how to speak and write correctly, and, just as important, to teach them a standard of right and wrong. They want their schools to help their children develop, as Thomas Jefferson said, both an honest heart and a knowing head. Unfortunately, parents today all too often find themselves confronted with so-called experts and a large battery of misguided opinion that says their children's education should be what they call value neutral. Well, to me, and I bet most Americans, a value-neutral education is a contradiction in terms. The American people have always known in their bones how intimately knowledge and values are intertwined. We don't expect our children to rediscover calculus on their own, but some would give them no guidance when it comes to the even more fundamental discoveries of civilization, our ethics, morality, and values. If we give our children no guidance here, if we give them only a value-neutral education, we're robbing them of their most precious inheritance, the wisdom of generations that is contained in our moral heritage. Our founding fathers weren't neutral when it came to values. We hold these truths to be self-evident, they wrote in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Our forefathers found their inspiration, justification, and vision in the Judeo-Christian tradition that emphasizes the value of life and the worth of the individual. It most certainly was never their intention to bar God from our public life. And, as I have said before, the good Lord who's given our country so much should never have been expelled from our nation's classrooms.
Thank you for listening. For more information on the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, including information on how to become a member, information on upcoming exhibits at the Reagan Library, or more information on the legacy of President Reagan, please visit reaganfoundation.org. And don't forget to like and follow the Reagan Foundation on all social media platforms.